In a newsletter for my publication, Prosperity Homestead, I talked about increasing property values fast and forever using simple strategies. I gave one example about after you move out of a home, make the home available for rent, and then do all your deferred maintenance while it's a rental property because it has certain tax advantages. In this newsletter, Sustainable Wealth Secrets, I'm going to share additional details. I'm Justin Hitt from Sustainable Wealth Secrets, and let's talk about the value of converting your home into a rental for the purposes of either minimizing your capital gains or, the most important part, having someone else pay off your mortgage. So there's a couple bits of this strategy that are important. First off, you want to get a home that is the worst home in the best neighborhood. You want to go someplace and buy the worst house in the best neighborhood and clean it up as a living space. Now, you want to, one of the reasons you might do this, for example, is you might find a better school district. And you want to get into that school district, and the quality of the school district is actually inflated home prices, and that's fine. But you've got kids that are school age, so you find a nice little neighborhood, you get the worst house in the neighborhood, and you clean it up. Now, first off, if it's the worst house in the neighborhood, you'll probably get it at a discount. And then you clean it up while you're living there. You might put a new roof on it. You might replace the windows. You might improve it cosmetically. But then ultimately your kid graduates from school, no longer needs to go to that school. They're off at college. What do you do next? Well, you can transition out of that home, turning it into a rental property. You know that the school district is good. That is an attractant factor. Now you can start putting in the major maintenance and repairs that increase the cost basis of the home. But here's the important part. The tenant is paying the mortgage. The tenant is paying the utilities on the property. The tenant is, in fact, even paying for the upgrades to the home, because rent can be adjusted with time. You can't necessarily, your income doesn't necessarily increase over time, but rents always increase over time. As the neighborhood improves, as you get quality tenants in the property, you're now able to write off, depending on your income level, have a deduction associated with the property. Now, if it's structured in an LLC or it's structured in some kind of investment vehicle, you may not have to pay any taxes on the properties. And actually, all these improvements, as long as you keep the cost basis of the property much less than the appraised value of the property, you could actually be building equity in the property. The longer it's rented out, the more the tenants have covered your costs. And essentially, you're getting an asset for free. Now, a lot of folks will look at that and say, oh my God, that is capitalism, putting the burden of cost on the citizen. Because a lot of times you'll find these worst house in the best neighborhood is kind of a working class neighborhood. And it's going to be good quality people. They've got full-time jobs. They usually have a family with children as well. They're centered around a certain school district. They're centered around a certain recreational activities. And some might say, well, look, this wealthy person who, they skip the fact that you are actually a resident of this neighborhood and probably fit the same demographic I just described. But this, quote, wealthy person, now when they reach retirement, now when they reach to scale down a little bit, they don't have kids anymore and they want to get a smaller home. Well, you can convert that home and provide quality housing for another family who wants access to that school, who wants access to those amenities. Now, the quality family has to pay rent or a payment someplace else. You're actually reducing their risk, because at the end of the period of time where their kid is at school, if they decide to move, they have no liability, no property to get rid of or to manage. In fact, they don't need to worry about the maintenance of that property. They don't need to worry about even cutting the grass. I like personally to make sure the grass is mowed and have some kind of contract for landscaping while I have a tenant in a property, because renters can reduce property values. However, there are mitigating factors that we talk about in some of my other programs. The point being is that when I talked about permanently increasing property values and I talk about the potential to turn a property into a rental, it immediately triggers folks to think that that's going to reduce the value of the property, but it actually can become a tax shelter for improvements on the property, which the cosmetic and the actual physical improvements on the property increases the property values for the whole neighborhood. It really makes a difference to that community. Plus, it provides housing, safe housing. Now, I'm not going to say safe and affordable housing, because rents are always market rate. You could charge triple the rent, but you better provide some value because the renter has more choices than the property owner. And so ultimately, this model gives you an opportunity to build up that house, to get the quality of the house. Now, if you have a lower income or you take a sabbatical, for example, you could actually take the passive losses up to, I think it's $25,000. Be sure to check with your CPA. You could take those passive losses from the property as tax deductions during the period in which you manage this particular property. And those losses may consist primarily of the improvements on the property itself. Now, you're going to have these are capital improvements like a new roof and major repairs. And maybe you put a deck on the property. Maybe you change the roof line a little bit so that water doesn't get into the foundation, and you improve the foundation by doing a basement remodel. These are capital improvements in many cases that would have to get written off over time. So this isn't you just move out of the house, you rent it for a couple years, then you sell it. This is something that you would be a long-term investment. The good news about this is that even though you may not be able to take the passive losses because you have a higher income, when you go to sell the property, you can actually offset and get cash with closing while on your taxes taking a major loss on the property. Now, again, the math is important here. Everything we talk about sustainable wealth secrets has a basis in mathematics. If you spend more money than the house is worth to make the house better so that you can either attract higher rents or so that it increases in property values, or you're taking a gamble that it increases in property values, you will not have the equity position in order to sell the house short term if you had to. So this is important. You lived in a house. You sell the house. You continue to do all this maintenance. You continue to do these capital expenditures, and you've kept it below the known asset value, the known liquidation value of the property. It gives you maybe $20,000, $30,000 in equity. If something happens, we have a global pandemic, we have a massive change in the marketplace. That school that was the anchor and the reason why that property is worth so much in the beginning, all of a sudden loses its accreditation, has a fire and doesn't reopen. You want to be able to sell the home at a liquidation price and get some cash at closing. Okay. You cannot rely on the tax deduction itself because the tax deduction offsets taxes. It's not a dollar for dollar reimbursement of investment. So the investor class always benefits if they do the basic math. The investor class can go buy a dilapidated, old, crappy home, live in it for 2 years, flip it to a rental. If they have to sell it, they can sell it and not have the capital gains that they would have if they just flipped it. You can sell it and take the proceeds of that and put it in a different property and pay no taxes. All of these strategies, a competent CPA can sit down with you and go over as part of your planning, as part of your approach. You may even be able to get into a situation where you can move into a neighborhood, and then over the course of 5 or 10 years, you can buy up other properties in the neighborhood and do the exact same thing. Now, a really good long-term tenant is a working class individual, somebody who works full-time. And by the way, there are many affluent working class individuals, blue-collar folks who make 6 figures and better, who are just simply looking for a quality house, someplace to live without a lot of disruption. Now, if they're in the trades and they're pretty handy, they may want to own the home because they're probably using the same strategy I'm sharing with you right now. But if they're in a professional environment where maybe they work in an office, maybe they're an accountant, CPA, lawyer, perhaps they're a project manager or middle management, they're going to want to be in a home that has no maintenance, that has a little bit of quality lawn, it's in a quality neighborhood, it's near amenities, it's near schools, and the larger the collection of those types of properties you have, the easier it will be to place tenants. You're going to be at 85%, 90% occupancy rate. Older retired individuals are actually great tenants too, because even though they have a fixed income, they tend to be longer term tenants. And you might have to do some accessibility type things for the property, but a lot of that stuff can be installed and removed later. But ultimately, here's the magic of what I'm describing here. You're going to get both appreciation value of the property if it's available. You're going to get the asset value increase as you have improved the property. You're going to get the cash flow from the tenant renting the property. You may even get tax benefits and solar credits and energy efficiency credits if you do the things we talk about at Prosperity Homestead. But you may even be able to later, should zoning change, split out the property and add additional units. I was working with somebody in the Virginia Beach area who would buy adjacent properties over time. And so they'd start out with one house, and then they'd buy the house to the left, and they'd buy a house to the right, and then they'd buy the house. They'd end up with like 4 lots. And there was a certain amount of square footage that once you achieve that square footage, you could actually bulldoze all the houses and put in apartments. And so he could go from 4 or 5 units to suddenly 25 units. And so depending on the neighborhood, he could end up with 5 units that are each renting out for $900 a month, and then end up with 25 units that each rent out for $800 a month. Now you might be saying, well, Justin, his rent went down. Well, the number of units went up so much that he's got a better cash flow, and the cost of the property stayed the same. You might be saying, well, Justin, to build a 25 unit apartment building costs a lot of money. Sure. There again is the math. What is it worth? How much are you in on the properties that you've got? If they were converted, what is the cost of conversion? All of this can be worked out on paper. That's the magic of what we talk about here in Sustainable Wealth Secrets. Before you do a repair to the home you live in, you can look at your 5-year plan. If you're going to move soon, well, you can delay that capital expense because you're going to rent the property out. If you're going to sell the property out, maybe you're expecting to move out of state. If you're going to sell that property out, well, then you look at that factor. If I'm going to sell it out, what is my cost basis? What can I get for it in the marketplace? What is it worth? Can I keep the property, rent it out, take the equity out of the property, use it to buy another rental, more desirable rental property, or a smaller home that I'm going to skip through? I met a guy, 25 properties like this. He was in the military, and as he went from base to base, he would buy new properties. And now he got cycled back through the same bases, so he ended up with 2 or 3 properties in one neighborhood, 1 or 2 properties in another neighborhood, 1 property here, 2 properties there. 25 units around military bases being leased to other soldiers, being leased to other individuals who are receiving funds to pay for their home, housing allowance, quality individuals. And his portfolio of 25 houses, he would just simply sell a house a year as he's retiring. Another individual did something similar over in the Norfolk Virginia area, and he would buy apartment buildings. He'd go find an okay neighborhood, get the worst apartment building, clean it up, put in security, better dumpsters, better parking areas, better lighting, clean the whole area up, 25, 30, 40 units. And some of these were as low as like 8 units. But ultimately, he built this portfolio up. He clustered all of his buys in a certain area. He actually lived in the properties for like 10 or 15 years, and then ultimately cashed out of one of the properties, bought a nice little house on a back canal. He's really into boating, so he wanted to be on the water, and eventually sold that and moved back into a condo when he's now, I think he's 86 years old. These things really work. The key is to understand you got to work with your tax professionals. You got to work with your CPA and even work with your lawyer, because the structuring is important as well. There are ways to take the passive losses immediately using the structure, and there are ways to bank those passive losses so that when you're retired, you can receive. So the 86-year-old, now that he's retired, is still taking the passive losses as a reduction in taxes, while he receives a large amount of interest from capital investments. So he basically, the dividends from his stocks are being, the tax for capital gains on that are being offset by the losses of properties that have been around for 30 years. And then as he needs another lump sum of cash, he either sells the property to an investor where he finances it and the investor pays him payments over every month, or he sells it outright and receives the check into a trust, which then drips the money back out. Now, all of these structures are speculative for your situation. I'm not providing legal advice. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just sharing with you what's possible. And if you're going to buy a house, you might as well make the house pay for itself over time. I have done the math for people and looked at situations where day one, they put down X number of dollars in the house, and we calculated how much do they pay into that house versus what they'd have to pay in general market if to have any kind of living space. And then at the end of the point where they moved, they were actually positive for having that house. They actually made money in that house. And so there are options to look at, do I have to send my kid to private school, or is there a decent public school? Do I homeschool the kid, and are there amenities to support that? We factored out these types of items on paper and realized they made money at the sale of their home. Not only did they increase property values by how they maintained it, they had picked a property that was already going to increase in property values because of where it was located. I know I've covered a lot here. I'm Justin Hitt with Sustainable Wealth Secrets, and we've just covered a little bit more depth about how to increase property values and how to do it in such a way that actually builds equity in the home, and that equity translates to net worth. I've got a huge program on this. I've worked with real estate investors. I've worked with affluent individuals. I've worked with a lot of folks and just took notes of what they did. And I've even used some of these strategies and can share my stories, but it's much more than what I can fit into a podcast. So again, if you have any questions about this program or anything I cover here at Sustainable Wealth Secrets, please visit us at www.sustainablewealthsecrets.com. I'm Justin Hitt. I'm here to help you take more of your income and transform it into wealth and to build the lifestyle and the security that you desire. Thanks for listening.